January 1st, 1945. The Ardennes Forest. The air is a freezing gray shroud, biting through the flight suits of the Luftwaffe pilots, screaming low over the treetops. For years, the German fighter corps had operated under a mathematical certainty. If you flew fast enough and stayed more than 10 feet from a shell's trajectory, you were safe. Anti-aircraft fire was a game of luck, a clumsy attempt to hit a moving bird with a pebble. Major Hans Ulrich, banking his Focke-Wulf 190, looks to his left. He sees the American batteries below. Thin, rhythmic flashes of 90mm guns. He feels a familiar contempt of the veteran. The Americans are firing, but they aren't even close. The shells are exploding 30, 40 feet away. Then the world turns white. Without a direct hit, without a single piece of steel touching the fuselage, his wingman's aircraft simply disintegrates. There is no lead-up, no near miss. One moment the plane is there. The next, it is a falling wreckage of burning magnesium. Hans Ulrich feels a cold sweat that has nothing to do with the winter air. The Americans haven't just improved their aim. They have changed the laws of physics. They have turned the very air around the German planes into a lethal trap. The era of the lucky shot is over. The era of the proximity fuse has begun. To understand why the proximity fuse was regarded as a miracle by the Allies and a nightmare by the Axis, one must first look at the staggering, almost impossible math of anti-aircraft warfare in the early 1940s. Before 1943, hitting a fast-moving aircraft from the ground was not a matter of skill. It was a matter of statistical luck. At the onset of the war, the world's most advanced militaries relied on two types of shells, the contact fuse and the time delay fuse. The contact fuse was the simplest. It required a physical, metal-on-metal collision for a gunner on a pitching deck of a destroyer or a shivering soldier in a muddy trench to hit a target moving at 300 miles per hour at an altitude of 10,000 feet was akin to trying to hit a flying dragonfly with a needle from a mile away. Often, thousands of rounds were expended to bring down a single bomber. If the shell missed by even an inch, it continued harmlessly into the clouds, eventually falling back to Earth as spent shrapnel. The second option was a time delay fuse. This was a mechanical masterpiece of clockwork precision, but it was plagued by human error. A gunner had to estimate the plane's altitude and speed, calculate the time of flight for the shell, and then manually set a mechanical timer on the nose of projectile. If the gunner estimated the flight time at 15 seconds, but the plane was actually 16 seconds away, the shell would explode harmlessly in front of the target. If the pilot banked or dipped just as the trigger pulled, the entire calculation was rendered useless. In the early stages of the London Blitz and the air battles over the Pacific, the numbers were grim. It was estimated that for every enemy aircraft shot down, nearly 2,500 rounds of heavy ammunition were fired. The Luftwaffe and the Imperial Japanese Navy viewed Allied anti-aircraft fire not as a wall of death, but as a nuisance, a pyrotechnic display that rarely resulted in a kill. German scientists, confident in their superior ballistics and radar research, mocked the primitive Allied attempts to shield their fleets. They believed the Americans were simply throwing money and steel at a problem that physics had already declared unsolvable. The sky, it seemed, belonged to the fast and the bold. But in the quiet laboratories of Washington and Baltimore, the Americans were preparing to miniaturize the impossible. They weren't looking for a better clock. They were looking for a way to give a shell a brain of its own. The solution to the unsolvable problem of anti-aircraft fire didn't come from a battlefield, but from a clandestine group of scientists working in a converted Chevrolet dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland. This was the birthplace of Section T, a top-secret division of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, led by the brilliant and relentless physicist Merle Tuve. Their mission was so sensitive that it was ranked alongside the Manhattan Project in terms of strategic importance. They weren't just building a weapon. They were attempting to build a rugged, miniature radio station that could survive being shot out of cannon. The concept was a variable time VT fuse. Unlike a timer, this fuse would emit a continuous radio signal as it screamed through the air. When the radio waves bounced off a metal object, like the wing of a Junkers or a Mitsubishi, the reflected signal would create a beat note. When that reflection reached a certain intensity, indicating the shell was within 70 feet of the target, the circuit would close and the shell would detonate. it would turn a near miss into a kill zone. However, the technical hurdles were immense. German scientists, who had toyed with the idea, ultimately dismissed it as a laboratory fantasy. They believed that no vacuum tube, the fragile glass components that powered radios of the era, could ever survive the setback force of being fired from a gun. A 5-inch naval gun subject a shell to a force of 20,000 Gs, 20,000 times the force of gravity, and spins at 30,000 rotations per minute. To the German mind, the American effort was a waste of resources. They mocked the idea that delicate electronics could be hardened against such violence. But the Americans were resourceful and inventive. Under Two's direction, the team at the Applied Physics Laboratory tested thousands of designs. They filled tubes with wax, encased circuits in revolutionary new plastics, and dropped them from the tops of buildings. By 1942, they had achieved the impossible, a ruggedized, miniaturized vacuum tube that didn't just survive the blast, it functioned with clinical precision. While the Luftwaffe remained confident in their speed and altitude, the Americans were quietly filling the magazines of their battleships with a secret of Section T. The trap was set, and the Axis powers were flying directly into it, completely unaware that the very nature of the sky had changed. The sheer technical audacity of the proximity fuse cannot be overstated. In 1940, a standard radio was A. By the summer of 1944, a new and terrifying threat loomed over Great Britain. The V-1 flying bomb, or the Buzz bomb. These were the world's first cruise missiles, pilotless, post-jet power machines of terror launched from occupied France. They moved at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, far faster than most traditional anti-aircraft guns could track. London was being pulverized, and the psychological toll on the civilian population was reaching a breaking point. The British Operation Diver was failing. Conventional time-fused shells were useless against a target that didn't bank or turn, but simply streaked across the sky at a constant, high velocity. The math was impossible. By the time we're going to set a mechanical fuse, the V-1 had already moved hundreds of yards. Desperate, Winston Churchill appealed to the United States for their special secret. General Eisenhower made a monumental decision. He would lift the land use ban. For the first time, the proximity fuse would be used over solid ground. Thousands of VT-equipped shells and the newly developed SER 584 radar units were rushed to the English coast. The results were instantaneous and staggering. In the first few weeks of August, the kill rate for anti-aircraft batteries skyrocketed. On one historic day, out of 104 V-1 rockets detected by the coastal batteries, 68 were blown out of the sky before they could even reach the outskirts of London. By the end of the month, the success rate climbed to an unbelievable 79%. The unsolvable V-1 threat was neutralized not by daring fighter pilots, but by a radio and a shell that could calculate an intercept point faster than any human mind. The German scientists at Piemont, who had designed the V-1 to be the vengeance weapon that would win the war, watched in disbelief as their wonder weapons were swatted down like flies. The mockery was over. The realization was beginning to set in. While the victory over the V-1s in England was a triumph of defense, the proximity fuse's most terrifying debut occurred during the final, desperate German gas of the war, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. For years, the ban on using the fuse over land remained in place to prevent the Germans from recovering a dud. But as Hitler unleashed his panzers through the snowy forests of the Ardennes, General Dwight D. Eisenhower realized that the security of a secret was no longer worth the lives of his surrounded soldiers. On December 18th, the blackout was lifted. The German military doctrine relied heavily on the time-on-target artillery barrage, but they assumed American shells would either explode on impact with the muddy ground, muffling the blast, or require precise timing to explode in the air. They were wrong. The proximity fuse allowed American 90mm and 105mm guns to achieve air bursts with 100% consistency. As German infantry moved through the woods, American shells began detonating exactly 30 to 50 feet above their heads. The effect was apocalyptic. In a traditional artillery strike, soldiers could dive into a foxhole or stay prone to survive. With the VT fuse, the shrapnel rained straight down, turning the very foxholes the Germans used for cover into death traps. The frozen ground offered no protection. German commanders were horrified. Reports began filtering back to Berlin describing invisible shells that seemed to seek out concentrations of troops with demonic precision. One German officer, captured after a barrage, famously asked his American captors about the automatic cannons they were using, refusing to believe that a standard artillery piece could be so lethal. The mockery of American tech had been replaced by a primal, paralyzing fear. In the Ardennes, the proximity fuse didn't just break the German advance. It broke the German soldiers' withstand in the open. As 1945 dawned, the psychological impact of the proximity fuse on the German Luftwaffe was total. Pilots who had spent the early war years as the knights of the sky now felt like condemned men. During the final major German air offensive, Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe attempted a surprise low-level strike against Allied airfields. They expected to catch the Americans off guard. Instead, they flew into a storm of VT fuse fire that turned the sky into a furnace. The German pilots realized that their speed, their altitude, and their maneuvers no longer mattered. The invincible Luftwaffe was being dismantled by an enemy that didn't even need to hit them to kill them. This realization led to a catastrophic drop in morale. Veteran pilots began to find excuses to avoid missions, and the remaining fuel and planes were wasted as pilots grew increasingly hesitant to engage American protected targets. General George S. Patton, a man not known for hyperbole, sent a glowing report to the War Department regarding the funny new shells. He wrote, "The new shell with the funny fuse is the most important development in the art of war since the discovery of gunpowder." It was the ultimate validation of the scientists at Section T. When the war ended and Allied intelligence officers finally interviewed the German scientists who had once mocked American technology, the shock was palpable. The Germans revealed that they had indeed attempted to create a proximity fuse, but had abandoned it as physically impossible given the state of electronic miniaturization. They were stunned to find that the primitive Americans had mass-produced over 22 million of these devices by the end of the war. The industrial might of the United States had not just outproduced the Axis, it had outthought them in the most complex field of the era. The story of the proximity fuse is more than a chronicle of a clever invention. It is the ultimate testament to the arsenal of democracy. While the world's attention was captured by the blinding flash of the atomic bomb, it was a humble, miniaturized vacuum tube, no larger than a thumb, that arguably did more to preserve the Allied path to victory on a day-to-day basis. It protected the life-giving convoys in the Atlantic, shielded the thin-skinned carriers in the Pacific, and silenced the vengeance weapons over London. History often remembers the Axis powers of their Wunderwaffen or Wonder Weapons, the Tiger tanks, the V-2 rockets, and the Me-262 jets. Yet, the proximity fuse reveals a deeper truth about the conflict. The Germans and Japanese focused on visible power, while the Americans focused on invisible precision. By shrinking a radio station into a projectile, American scientists proved that industrial scale combined with radical innovation was the true superweapon. The mockery of the German scientists serves as a permanent historical lesson in the dangers of technical arrogance. They believed their mastery of the old rules of physics made them invincible, failing to realize that the United States was busy rewriting the rules entirely. Today, the lineage of the VT fuse lives on in every smart munition and satellite-guided missile in the modern arsenal. It was the moment warfare moved from the era of guesswork into the era of intelligence. As the sun set over liberated Europe in 1945, the skies were finally quiet. The Luftwaffe had been swept away not just by more planes or more pilots, but by a 5-cent vacuum tube and the relentless, resourceful spirit of a nation that refused to believe anything was impossible. Bulky piece of furniture, filled with fragile hand-blown glass vacuum tubes that would shatter if dropped on a carpeted floor. The mission for the American scientists was to take the entire functional circuitry of a radio, a transmitter, a receiver, and an amplifier, and compress it into a space no larger than a pint of ice cream. This device then had to be rugged enough to be accelerated to supersonic speeds in a fraction of a second. The heart of the weapon was a ruggedized vacuum tube. American industrial giants like Sylvania and Raytheon were tasked with a near-impossible feat of engineering, creating tubes with filaments that wouldn't snap under 20,000 Gs. They experimented with new materials, eventually using a series of tiny rubber mounts and potting compounds to float the electronics inside the shell. But the electronics were only half the battle. To power this miniature radio, a battery was required. A standard dry cell battery would lose its charge sitting in a warehouse, rendering the shell a dud. The American solution was a stroke of genius known as a reserve battery. They placed the battery acid in a small glass ampoule. When the gun was fired, the massive shock of the setback would shatter the glass. The centrifugal force of the shell's 30,000 revolutions per minute spin would then sling the acid into battery plates, activating the circuit only after it had left the barrel. It was a masterpiece of resourceful engineering, a weapon that remained dormant and safe until the exact microsecond it was needed to hunt. While the technical hurdles were being cleared, a different kind of war was being fought, a war of silence. The proximity fuse was a secret so sensitive that its security protocols rivaled those of the atomic bomb. The U.S. Navy and the War Department lived in a state of constant paranoia that a dud shell might fall into enemy hands. If a German or Japanese scientist could recover an unexploded VT fuse, the technology could be reverse engineered in months, or worse. They could develop simple radio jamming countermeasures that would render the billion-dollar invention useless. To prevent this, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a draconian order. The proximity fuse was strictly prohibited from being used over land. It was to be used exclusively by the Navy in the open ocean, where any missed shell would sink to the bottom of the Pacific or Atlantic, thousands of feet beyond the reach of Axis divers. This created a logistical and moral tension. Commanders in Europe begged for the shells to stop the devastating Luftwaffe raids on Allied supply lines, but Washington remained firm. The risk of the enemy discovering the radio brain was too high. Even on ships, the shells were stored in specially marked lockers, and crews were forbidden from discussing their magical accuracy. Thousands of crates of the most effective anti-aircraft ammunition in history sat in warehouses during the height of the Blitz and the early Italian campaigns, locked away by a command structure that feared a security leak more than they feared the enemy's bombs. The Americans were holding a winning hand, but refused to play it until the stakes were absolute. As American ships began to decimate Japanese and German air raids with uncanny precision, the Axis intelligence services were thrown into a state of panic confusion. In the Pacific, Japanese pilots returning from raids on the U.S. Navy reported a terrifying phenomenon. The Americans didn't seem to be aiming at the planes themselves, but rather the empty air around them, and yet the planes were still exploding. The Imperial Japanese Navy, steeped in their own technological pride, initially dismissed these reports as hallucinations of stressed pilots or the result of a massive increase in American gunner training. In Germany, the Luftwaffe High Command was even more skeptical. Their scientists had already proven that miniaturizing a radio into a shell was physically impossible. Consequently, they began to develop elaborate, incorrect theories to explain the Allied success. German intelligence theorized that the Americans had developed a supernatural mechanical predictor, a primitive computer that could track a plane's flight path with 100% accuracy. They believed the Americans had simply mastered the time delay fused to a degree that defied logic. Because they convinced themselves that the Americans were just better at the old way, the Germans stopped looking for a new secret. They didn't even consider the possibility of a proximity trigger. This arrogance was their undoing. While German engineers spent thousands of hours trying to improve their mechanical clockwork fuses and optical rangefinders, they were essentially perfecting a candle while the Americans were turning on the light bulb. The German mockery of American industrial power blinded them to the reality that their superior Luftwaffe was being lured into a technical slaughterhouse. The theoretical brilliance of Section T was finally put to the ultimate test on January 5, 1943, in the shark-infested waters near Guadalcanal. The light cruiser USS Helena was steaming through the Solomon Islands when a formation of 4 Japanese IG-D-3 Aval dive bombers emerged from the clouds. In any previous engagement, these planes would have been a grave threat, likely requiring hundreds of rounds to deter. But the Helena's magazines were filled with a new, secret cargo, the VT fuse. The Japanese pilots, veteran aviators who had survived the early years of the war, executed their standard attack runs. They banked and dove, confident that the erratic bursts of American anti-aircraft fire would follow the same predictable, inaccurate patterns they had seen since Pearl Harbor. They expected the puffs of black smoke to appear far behind or well below them. The Helena opened fire with its 5-inch guns at a range of nearly 2 miles. The first salvo was not a direct hit. By the old standards, it was a total miss. But as the shells streaked past the lead Japanese bomber, the radio brains inside the fuses felt the proximity of the metal fuselage. The air around the valve suddenly erupted in a series of perfectly timed detonations. The lead plane didn't just smoke. It was shredded in midair by a cone of high-velocity shrapnel. Moments later, a second bomber was swatted from the sky. The remaining Japanese pilots, terrified by the invisible wall of steel that seemed to find them regardless of their maneuvers, broke formation. One Japanese survivor later remarked that it felt as if the Americans were hooking the shells to the planes with wires. The engagement lasted only minutes, but the data sent back to Washington was clear. The proximity fuse worked. The mockery of the Axis scientists was about to meet the cold reality of American industrial slaughter.